Hey, what is up everybody? This is Meyer, and in this video what I want to do is talk about the Trance kick and bass, or in particularly the low end, which is your kick and your sub, pretty much taking up all the low end. And those of you who've been watching all my recent videos know that the track I've been using before has been my remix of Walk Away, just because it's the track people were asking the most about. But doing the sub, I wanted to go over this track Sigma that I've done actually here in FL Studio, because I think I did a much better job with the sub in this track. So yeah, I feel like it's just a better example of what you can do with it. So the main part I want to focus on is this part starting at bar 33, where the sub comes in. Now it looks like it's bar 34, but it's because I inserted a bar of silence, so when I do the mastering, it doesn't. All these processors have some time to kind of initialize before there's actually signal coming into them. But yeah, let's take a listen. I'll start like maybe a bar before. And then just soloing the kick and the sub, you can hear what's going on. And if I had the mid basses, you can kind of hear. So the main thing I want to do, and is what I'm going to do here, is I'm going to put a spectrum analyzer, once this thing decides to load, on the selected mixer channel. And the reason I'm doing this here is so if I put this on high resolution here on the mid bass bus, you can see pretty much everything below 80 or 60 hertz is just completely cut out of these mid basses, and this is intentional. If you look, every single one of these mid basses is going to have a low cut filter on them. Whoops, in the mixer channel. So mid bass 1, 2, 3, and 4, and in addition to low cut filters at 24 dB per octave, or 4-pole filters, there's another low pass filter. High pass filter, low cut filter on the bus channel. And this is just, once again, you don't want the mid basses interfering with your low end. Some of you guys were asking me, how do you get the best low end in your track? And I actually think the best way to do it is more subtractive, is making sure none of your other elements have any low end that could be interfering with your kick and sub. And the reason for this is, if you think about what's going on here, the wavelength or the frequency of these are, the kick and your sub, your low frequencies, are much longer than the wavelength of these higher frequencies. So as a result, two notes that can be playing together can actually phase cancel a lot more and cause you a lot more problems than with these instruments, where like the high frequency instruments, where yeah, you have some phase canceling, that's not a big deal. Whereas with these low frequencies, you can imagine that due to the way that they're kind of set up, any phase cancellations, anything playing at the same time, can cause these huge gaps in your low end. So you want to tighten it up, make sure all your other instruments are not interfering with your low end. And that also includes things like any of your reverb sends. You'll notice across the board here, I have these low cut filters on all these send channels, just to make sure that none of these instruments are interfering with the low end. So as for the kick and the sub, I want to particularly talk about the sub. The processing on the kick is pretty simple. Let's go through what's going on here. So we got filter and volume automation just to control it over time. And this LFO tool isn't really doing much, as opposed to just acting as an oscilloscope. And what I think is a better way to demonstrate this, rather than using this LFO tool, is if I go put on this this megascope. So I'll put this on the kick. I'll put it on the sub. Let's go ahead and do the megascope. And this is here on the kick. On the sub, I'm going to put this after the LFO tool, just so we can see it. Kick in the sub, and I'm also going to put one on the mid bass bus. So let's go mega scope. And these things kind of got a little bit messed up. So I like using this scope because it's a tempo synced scope. So the sub, I generally have blue. The kick, I generally have red. And this kick and bass bus, I'll just have as white. And I could also show these mid basses too, but they're not really in a place where they're going to interfere too much with the low end. But I'll put this on anyway, the megascope, so we can see what all these things are doing at the same time. Oops. Oh yeah, this is a mid bass bus. So let's go ahead and make this kind of a lighter blue color, just to match what's going on. So taking a look at the kick. This is the kick. First things first, I have it going through. Let me actually view. Let me just close all the plugin windows so that way we can start fresh. First thing the kick is doing, rolling off that low end that's just going to be interfering, and a little bit of boost on the low end. Next, I'm running it through the Vertigo VSC2 compressor. Which kind of brings out the top end. So what this is doing here is this is clamping down. It's letting that initial transient through a little bit. So the attack is set to 3 milliseconds. So it's letting that first attack through and then clamping down on the release, which kind of gives it this nice little character where it's fattening up the kick by letting that transient through and then clamping down on the rest of the sample. Then it's going through another EQ, which I just felt like it needed even maybe a little bit more boost. Sometimes these compressors can take out a little bit of the low end because what's going on is it's clamping down on that signal right after the transient comes through. Then it's kind of acting down on that part of the kick that you may want it to breathe. So that's what this is doing. And that's it. I mean, it started off as a great sample and it didn't really need a lot of processing. So, of course, looking at the Megascope, you can notice here, and this will be easier to see with when I'm playing it with the sub. Kick takes out about 2/16 notes, and the sub is taking up the rest of them. So let's take a look at our sub. It looks like there's a lot of stuff going on, but a lot of this stuff isn't doing anything. So don't really want to be confusing anybody with this. So I'm going to take these guys off. Cool. So let's take them all off. Now, there are two volume automations, and I'll explain what both of them are doing. One of these volume automations is just volume automation throughout the entire track, so can bring the sub in and out as we want to. But that other volume automation, what that's there for is evening out the volume. So you can either use a limiter, which is actually the way that I recommend doing it now, or if you want to be really precise, you can even out the volume of each note individually using a gain automation on each individual note. So if you look here in the arrangement here for the sub, there's two volume automations for the sub. This is the overall volume automation for the sub for the overall volume, and then this is each note. Every time the note changes, I'm adjusting the volume so that the sub is bang on hitting at the same dB no matter what. So let's take a look at the processing on our sub. The first thing we have is this EQ, which is just going to roll off the low end. And notice how I dip down this first harmonic here, which is just there allowing the transient to breathe. So if I turn this off, really just lets that fundamental through a little bit by cutting this first one. Next up is the Waves R bass, and I really used a lot of it here. I just think it sounded good like that. So really doing a lot to the sound. The other thing I should mention too, the MIDI for this isn't your standard like MIDI. It's playing on all these notes, but it's kind of what it's doing is double offbeat off, or double 16th note offbeat, which is an 8th note, double 16th and an offbeat. Now you're hearing these notes here at the beginning, but they're actually going to be side chained out, which you'll see in a moment. And then it's going through another EQ, which is boosting that fundamental just a little bit again. Because once again, this is the sub, so we really want that fundamental through, but of course, we're also allowing a little bit of this this kind of mid-bass range to come through as well. This LFO tool is probably the most important thing for your bass, because what it's doing, notice how this is like 1/16th note, 2/16th notes, 3/16th notes, and 4/16th notes. It's cutting the sub down for the first 2/16th notes to allowing the kick to go through, and then the sub is playing. So if I play that with a kick, and let me turn it off first, you'll hear how they're clashing, and then when I engage this LFO tool to take out this note, which, I mean, I could do it just by deleting these notes too, but you'll notice that some of these bleed over again. So by doing this, it may lessen some of the impact of the sub, but it increases the impact of the kick, and it makes sure that none of these two are playing at the same time, which means this entire track can get louder because I'm going to have more headroom because I don't have two sub bass instruments playing at the same time. So I'd originally been playing around with multiple of these sub bass patterns, which is why it looks like this and why I never ended up erasing it. But the important thing here, and for an example, let me just take out these notes that aren't really doing anything, and you can get an idea of what this LFO tool is actually doing, because it needs to be there. Look at this. You have pretty much a whole 16th note of the tail of this sub bleeding into the next bar when the kick is playing. When if you use this LFO tool, you can see that that gray part is the part that's being filtered out, and that's why it's important to have this LFO tool on your sub, even if these guys aren't technically lasting a bar, because these low frequencies, they're still hanging over. And part of the reason is the sub bass instrument has a little bit a non-trivial release amount, and then you want this, because if you were to have this be just right on the edge, you could end up getting these weird clicks and pops. Now, you're not getting it here because things are getting re-triggered, but this just makes sure that the notes are long enough that you're not getting any clicks from the amplitude envelope actually causing amplitude modulation on the envelope or the waveform itself. So that's why we give it a little bit of attack and a little bit of release. And then this LFO tool is just making sure that it's not bleeding over to when the kick is hitting. So if we look at these together, it's probably easier to see it with this megascope. And if I turn off this LFO tool, you can kind of see if I freeze this, where the kick hits and there's a little bit of overlap to kind of allow these sub bass hits to come in, and then the kick hits, then the sub bass, the kick hits, and the sub bass. Now how much separation you have between the kick and the sub bass is kind of a matter of taste, but I found that this works. And notice how the sub bass here, and if I make it a little bigger, you can see it a little better. You can see exactly how bang on this sub is. It's cutting off right before the beginning of the bar, so this kick can hit on in full force in your low end. And these are really the only instruments that are taking up this low end in the entire track, besides things like boom effects, things in the breakdown that could be having like a sub pad. But during any section of the track, drop all of these things. These are the only things playing that sub kind of below 60 or 80 hertz for the most part. Now let me bring in the mid bass so you can see how this envelope is hitting. So you can see here's the mid bass, but it's not really doing much to this overall waveform, except you can kind of see it got messed up a little bit. So let me do that. So kick, sub basses, and then here's the kick and the sub playing. This is actually the waveform with those mid basses playing, but you really only see the low frequencies here because they're taking up so much power. And otherwise, if I hadn't low cut this mid bass bus, you would see it kind of interfering with the low frequencies here. So it's very clear. You can actually track the waveform here. You have the kick hitting and its low frequencies or large wavelengths, and then you have your sub playing its areas of large wavelengths or low frequencies. And you can see that for the whole track right here with these two very important low ends. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover today, is really getting that low end of your uplifting trance working. And you don't really have that many options with your sub bass. Now, you can be creative, you can do other things, but you generally either have your offbeat sub bass or your double 16th notes, or what I did here, which is some combination of them. It doesn't really matter, but with uplifting trance, because it's so fast, 138 beats per minute, sometimes more, your creativity doesn't always lie, or the groove doesn't always lie in the pattern that your sub bass is using. A lot of times it's in what your mid basses are doing or your percussion. That's not to say you don't want to try to be creative. There's some great tracks that use non-offbeat sub basses. One that comes to mind is Adam Ellis' Don't Disappear. That one has an kind of a syncopated sub bass, and it works really well for that track. So definitely you want to be creative, you want to try other things, but I would say at least 90%, if not more, of uplifting trance, it's either an offbeat or double 16ths. Just because that's pretty much all the room that you have if you have your kick playing the low end at the very beginning. So anyway, I hope you guys found this helpful. Once again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, and I'll see you in the next video.